Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 19. We're going to be chatting with Arvid Rosengren, who won the world's best sommelier competition. He's going to be sharing what it was like to compete in that grueling competition, along with his best tips on choosing wine from a restaurant wine list, as well as pairing food and wine. Now, before we get started, I want to give a shout out to Alan Baker, who lives in Nova Scotia, and emailed me to say, quote, "Hello, Natalie. Just a note to say that I loved the Thomas Batchelder interview so much that I forwarded it to all 50 members of the Annapolis Valley Vintners, our winemakers club. All the best, Alan." Well, Alan, I'm so glad that you enjoyed that episode with Thomas about biodynamic and organic wine, which you can always listen to again. And thank you so much for sharing it with your club. I would love to hear from them as well, what they thought. I'll continue to give a shout out to others who've been kind enough to post a review on Apple Podcasts. That's iTunes, and that really, really helps the podcast get discovered. So if you at all have a notion of saying a kind word or two, that's the place to do it. But of course, you can tag me on social media or just email me. And if you want me to mention your website or social media handle, please include that in your review along with your name. I want to let others know how they can connect with you online. Now, back to this episode. You are so going to enjoy this chat with Arvid Rosengren, who is smart, passionate, and completely devoted to the world of wine. Enjoy. What would it be like to be named the world's best sommelier in competition with 60 other top-notch sommeliers from around the world in front of a live audience and very stern-faced judges watching you taste wine, describe it, all blind, meaning you don't see the labels, but you have to tell everything about the wine. You also have to serve them perfectly as you would in a restaurant and write a very detailed technical exam. Well, our next guest is going to tell us exactly what that feels like. Plus, he's going to share his tips for choosing wines from a restaurant list, as well as which questions should you ask the sommelier. So some very practical advice, too. Our guest was born and raised in Sweden and initially studied Nanotechnology Engineering, you can imagine, but decided to change his career path to food and wine. He has worked at several of the world's best restaurants in Stockholm, Copenhagen, Britain, and New York City. And in 2016, he won the world's best sommelier competition, competing with 60 other sommeliers, as I mentioned, the best from around the world. And this grueling competition is only held every 3 years. Welcome, Arvid Rosengren.
Thank you very much.
You're cool as a cucumber as usual, Arvid. I know you've been under pressure a lot of times in your life, but let's start with, what was the first wine that really made you take notice?
I guess there's been many of those situations, and I was already in wine before I had that moment. So I'm not necessarily as seriously as I am today, but I was working in a wine shop, and not a fancy, well-stocked. It was kind of a run-of-the-mill monopoly, as they are in Sweden, liquor and wine stores, and inevitably you get a bunch of questions. I was bringing home wine and tasting them, and the first wine that really, I think, triggered something in my brain, I don't even remember the producer, but it was a pretty basic co-op Nebbiolo from Piedmont, a Langhe Nebbiolo or some such. At the time, I just couldn't understand how all of these different things could be in the glass at the same time.
So when you say all these different things, do you mean aromas or flavors?
Different aromas and different perceptions and tannin and acidity. But mostly, I just remember loving how that smelled. It was such a great scent, so like multifaceted.
Awesome.
And I went down the rabbit hole of trying to figure out why that was.
Yeah. So that's your first memorable wine. Now, take us to the moment where you thought, oh, I want to become a sommelier. What was that moment? Where were you? What triggered that thought?
So as you were saying before, I was kind of deep into engineering studies. I was studying nanotech or nanoscience engineering in Sweden. And as much as I loved reading about the newest discoveries on the science front, I somehow halfway through that journey realized I would spend the rest of my life in a lab coat. And as great as that is, it wasn't for me. I had worked in restaurants previously, not very serious restaurants, but I really loved hospitality. And when I was a kid, I dreamt about being a chef. So I somehow found my way into working in a wine store. A friend got me a job, a summer gig, and I went on a hiatus and met a bunch of interesting people. A guy who I worked with at the time who had a much deeper and better sort of restaurant experience at the time we were working together, he told me like, hey, if you want to really get serious about this thing, and it seems like you've been away from your studies for 2 years, or close to at least, he said, you have to get into restaurants. Becoming a sommelier is the only way you're going to taste as much wine as you need to really be good at this.
Interesting. I'm curious why you pursued sommelier versus chef because you cooked for your young family. I think you said your mother was a emergency night nurse in rehab.
Not emergency, but she worked night
Okay.
shift on a rotation. So at some point, I cooked for my younger siblings. I really enjoyed that. It's one of those things where, especially in Europe, it's very traditional that if you take that step towards being in a culinary school, you do it at a very early age. I'm not saying it's a dead end, but it's very hard to get back to any sort of generalist studies if you go down that path. And you do that at age 15, 16. So I decided I was doing pretty well in school and decided to go down a different path.
So you continued with your studies because nanotech engineering isn't exactly basket weaving. So you had choices.
I had choices. And wine kind of satisfied two aspects. It satisfied my sort of nerdy side of like figuring out why things are the way they are, that kind of academic side of things, and that hospitality, take care of people
Yeah.
side. So it was a good compromise, isn't a fair word, but it was a good sort of mix of the two things that I really enjoyed doing.
I can see how that comes together. So let's take a moment and frame this a little bit. Do you have what I call a favorite failure, like a low point in your career or a moment or an anecdote where you learned something, you became better because of it? Maybe you could describe what that moment might have been.
There are plenty of those. One that stands was definitely not a failure because in hindsight, I think I did really well, but it felt like such a failure at the time. And this was when I was competing for my first time in the competition of the world's best sommelier, which is, like you said earlier, it's every 3 years. And to get to that point, you already have to be the best in your respective nation. So every country sort of sends a representative. And I was in Tokyo and competing, and I really wanted to do well. I really wanted to win, to be frank. I really was really pushing myself. I was studying so hard and tasting so much. And at the time, it was, like I said, it was my first competition, and no one's ever won on their first. But I kind of wanted to enjoy that sort of underdog status and slide through and do well. And I think I really, really did well. And I ended up not getting to the finals. The competition is over 3 days. So you start with all 60, then on day 2, you're 15, and then on day 3, it gets down to 3. So I was part of the 15, which was a massive success in itself, but I didn't appreciate it at the time. So when I was not part of the final 3, I was really upset and really angry, and I thought I'd done pretty well. One of the biggest lessons learned from that was you have to be there and sort of enjoy the moment, which I did much better at in 2016 when I ended up winning.
Yes. Why do you think you didn't place even in the top 3?
It's hard to say. I mean, I was in the top 15, I think, but it's hard to say. There's no official scores at that point. You don't get much feedback after you're done, but there's experience involved, and you kind of have to learn the way that things work too.
Sure.
So I don't think it was meant for me at the time. I was probably a little bit too eager in that sense, that I probably wasn't putting a smiley face and sort of the hospitality nature on. I was just like in it to win. And that's not the right way to go about it, I think.
Okay.
When I did win, I was in a much calmer state of mind.
Which is interesting because I know the preparation that you did, or I've read about it. In Japan, maybe this eagerness, but also nerves played a role, but you got a grasp on that. You hired an acting coach, didn't you, for the 2016 competition? Tell me about her. What kind of exercises did she get you doing to calm you down?
So I met with an acting coach a few times, and she gave me some really good tools. Her background was in stage acting, and sort of what I was looking for was an improv acting coach. And she gave me some great tips on how to stand and how to breathe. And
Oh, give us examples. What was she telling you to do? How should you stand?
in a way, it's really simple. But
Okay.
if you're in that situation, stand sort of broader legged than you think is appropriate. It was her way of putting it. Like, if you think you're getting too spread, it's probably good. It gives you a sort of broader base and a better way to breathe into your stomach and to calm your nerves. Really get a grounded base.
Okay,
And
so
she
your
also
wide leg stance.
yeah.
Okay. And so
And
what else?
she put me through a whole series of, I can't remember specifically, but it was, for me, sort of embarrassing exercises at the time. I'm sure anyone who's done theater is well accustomed to these kinds of things, but it's just like being slightly more comfortable and being nervous and being uncomfortable, I guess, on stage. Being able to laugh at yourself a little bit too.
Well, I've heard about improv being used for corporations to bond teams and so on, because you really have to act in the moment. It's very emotional. So I can imagine this was really great training for being on stage. Like, was she getting you to envisioning yourself calm, or like, was there some sort of mental exercises as well?
Yeah, I did
Okay.
a lot of those, like vision, trying to put yourself in that moment and seeing yourself calm and flowing and all that. I did the whole thing. I meditated every day for years and that whole thing.
What kind of meditation do you do?
Regular sitting down and breathing. I have to
Okay.
say, after my daughter was born and my mornings became different, I haven't. For about a year, I slacked off that.
Because you're a new parent. I think you can be excused. Yes.
Trying to get back to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you still do this, but Brazilian jiu-jitsu at lunch,
Yeah, still
something like
do.
that.
Still do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, not as much as I can, but it's a weird thing because it's a very aggressive sport. It's a real martial art. You're wrestling and trying to submit people and trying not to get your arms broken or getting your neck choked. It's a very active form of meditation, especially when most days I tend to work 6 or 7 days a week for anywhere between 10 to 16 hours. It's a lot, especially with being a new parent. If I can get that hour of very focused on something so sort of primal as sort of a life and death battle, it's helpful.
That's great. So describe kind of when you did win, what was the process? You say they narrow it down to three people. Do they bring all three of you on stage? Describe what it feels like, what the setting is, what the audience is. Give us a sense of where you were and what was happening.
The competition is over 5 days, three
Okay.
of which are sort of active competition. And you're tested on theoretical knowledge, which is definitely the bulk of what the time studying goes into. Like I said, I spent years preparing for this. So theoretical study is a lot of that. And it plays a massive role in getting far in the competition. But the further you get, the more sort of blind tasting and especially sort of practical tests take over. So the final stage of it, they call the 15 semifinalists on stage and essentially tell 12 of them to leave. And you sort of start right there in front of an audience performing sort of a mock restaurant setting. You'll go on one at a time and they'll tell you sort of, you'll have whatever 5 tables. They'll tell you this table over here has ordered a Magnum of red wine that they want decanted and served. And these people over here want the food and wine matching for this menu. And over here, you're going to do a little blind tasting and sort of various scenarios. And then they'll tell you have 17 minutes to do this. So you have to sort of allocate your time and then they'll try to trip you up as you go along. So sort of midway through decanting, they'll tell you that, oh, one person actually wants a dry martini cocktail, or whatever, sort of trap setting. None of it's really any harder than what you encounter in a restaurant, because that's what it's all about, being flexible and seeing to people's needs. But it's a very different thing when the spotlight's on and you're sweating and your nerves are telling you to run off stage and go hide. That's a very different thing.
Wow. You must have this inner core of calm. And I've read other people who have observed you in restaurant settings, just like it can be a busy, busy night and you're just centered. Do you think that whole training for this competition helped you with that?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people right now are laughing because I'm a pretty stressed person.
Really? You don't
for the
seem
most
it.
part. But I think it's one of those things. I think I can turn it on and off in that setting too, though. You can be as stressed as you need to be off stage. And once you're in front of people, you have to be able to switch it off.
Wow.
I mean, it's the same thing if you're working in a restaurant. You know that there are 6 or 7 tables that want to talk to you right now, but you have to prioritize and get out there and smile and pretend like they're the only ones that have your full attention, right?
That's grace under pressure, I must say. I wanted to ask favorite food and wine pairing or most difficult one. What pairing was that?
I could talk about any number of pairings. I think when it comes to food and wine pairing, it's one of those things that always comes up. I think as important as food and wine pairing is, I think the most important things that you eat, things that you enjoy, and drink things that you enjoy. Having worked with food and wine pairing menus in restaurants where we tested 100 wines to find the right 6 or 7 to serve with our food menus and still got very varied feedback from our guests.
Uh-huh.
I've come to realize that food and wine pairing is so subjective. Outside of those like super classic pairings,
Give us an example or two of the super classic pairings, just for those who are listening.
things like Sancerre and sort of Saint-Maur goat cheese or that kind of thing, right? Where it's just like it works. But once we get into like finer subtleties, it's really tough. And I think for the most part, the most important thing is to drink something you really enjoy. One thing that I do here that is a perfect pairing that has become a really classic at a restaurant here is we do a honey lacquered duck. So it's duck that's been sort of dry aged like beef, and then it's poached in honey and roasted. So it's like blackened skin. Duck to me tends to be sort of a lighter wine. Like you usually drink like a Burgundy or that kind of thing with duck.
Okay.
This comes out so like spicy and roasted and full of flavor that it's a really perfect pairing with Northern Rhone Syrah.
Okay, great. So what do people want Sauterne, a traditional Bordeaux dessert wine, with, say, ice cream? What do you do?
I think Sauterne, for the most part, is not a dessert wine.
Okay. Explain why.
Especially when it comes to things like ice cream. So again, this is like, I don't want to rack down on people who spend a lot of time on food and wine pairing, but after a while, it becomes intuitive. Here's the thing with sweet wine of the Sauterne kind. They're usually pretty high in alcohol too. Sauterne usually kind of clocks in at 11, 12, 13% alcohol, right? Probably 13% plus. It has to be, right? When you eat something cold with that, temperature lowers the perception of flavor, of aroma, but it doesn't lower the perception of alcohol. So what happens if you eat a scoop of ice cream and drink a glass of Sauterne is that Sauterne will taste less than it should and will feel more alcoholic than it should. I think Sauterne, if it's from like a great, really sort of sweet vintage, a really ripe vintage, can go well with things like classic caramelly tarts or almond cakes or tarte tatin or that kind of thing.
Okay.
I don't necessarily think it's a dessert wine. I prefer my Sauterne and that kind of wine with cigars or with cheese or with foie gras or that sort of thing. For dessert wines, I lean more towards lower alcohol things, usually like Riesling, whether it's ice wine or Baroness Leche, that kind of thing. I think it's more of a versatile wine.
I'm jumping all around here, but tell us how you prepared and studied for the exam. I mean, you just must have been tasting constantly. What did you do? Like, I'm imagining Rocky, the old movie, and he's drinking raw eggs and climbing the steps or whatever. But what were you doing?
It was like that. Like I said, I spent 7 years on sort of competition circuit, for lack of a better word, from becoming best sommelier in Sweden to winning the World Best title. I should say that's a short time. My 2 predecessors who won the title before me each spent over 2 decades before getting there. So I did it in a very intense manner. And I decided on that early that I would go hard, but try to get out quick. So part of that routine was that for the last, I think it was 6 or maybe 9 months, I wasn't allowed to look in our refrigerator. I had one shelf in the refrigerator that was like food and the rest was wine. So I had asked a bunch of friends and wine stores, etc., just like give them my credit card and send me 12 bottles of wine. And my wife, she worked normal hours and I worked restaurant hours. So she was usually up earlier than me and she'd pour slide of wines to taste blind in the morning.
Oh, how early? What time?
This is probably at 8 in the morning. That's early for me. I wake up before I eat any breakfast, before I do anything else. I blind taste these wines. I would either just film myself or I would connect with my coach back home in Sweden who would then give feedback on how I was doing. I used a camera a lot to figure out like if you have verbal tics, if you keep saying or
Wow.
you're doing that kind of thing.
So you were videoing yourself and then doing a replay like they do with football, like watching every play and every wrist
Yeah,
turn.
at some point I might release some of those embarrassing videos. So I did that every morning and every night. When I got home from work, there was another flight waiting for me. And of course, during the day, I was spending hours studying and also going to other colleagues around town, asking them to prepare blind tastings and spirit flights and practical tests for me, that kind of thing.
But you were working in a restaurant like 60, 80 hours a week. How did you squeeze all this in?
I didn't do much else. It was a hectic time. I didn't have any kids at that time. So right now, I probably wouldn't be able to do it.
Sure. And what about preparing for the spirits part of the competition? Because it's not just about wine, it's about all beverages. How do you taste all these spirits without destroying your palate?
I mean, it's real. Palate fatigue, especially when tasting booze, is real. So the key, if you want to become a good blind taster for spirits, it's exposure, I think. You got to smell a lot. Usually the blind tasting of spirits are sort of, let's say they put down 8 glasses. My goal is to be able to nail 5 or 6 on smell alone so that I don't have to start tasting until the very end. Because once you start tasting, you start messing with your palate and everything becomes difficult. You have to nail more than half of it on the nose alone and then move to taste. But spirits are easier. Spirits are usually so sort of defined by their category in the sense that it's pretty easy once you learn the sort of archetypes to start getting there.
And do you mean that like a tequila is always easily identifiable versus a Cabernet?
Exactly. Even if they're different, the differences are so marked, whereas the difference in wine can be very subtle. Sometimes you get Shiraz that tastes like Malbec and that kind of thing. You don't get that with spirits. If it's a Scotch, it's very different from a bourbon. And it's always going to be very different from a bourbon.
Okay, gotcha. Wow. You were in the Somm documentary, right, Arvid?
I'm in one scene in the new one coming out in a few weeks.
Oh, there's a new one coming out. Oh, I can't wait.
I don't know what my role is yet, but we'll see.
I would hope winner.
There's a blind tasting scene in that movie where I'm in.
Oh, so cool. So many people love that inside the industry. It's a documentary, folks, for those who haven't heard about this, called Somm. And I guess, this would be the third one. So let's go to some practical advice. What are your best tips or strategies when you're presented with a wine list, especially a good one that's kind of long? How do you approach it? What do you advise diners? Where do you start in choosing a wine from a restaurant list? Because often the wines are not wines we're familiar with in the liquor store by design, because you want to offer new taste experiences. So how do you attack that restaurant list?
There's a lot of stuff that I could say, but I think the most important thing is to be honest and to be clear in your desires. If we're going to be real here, I think very often it comes down to money as well, which is fair. I mean, wine on my wine list here at Legacy Records, I have wine from $45 on the wine list for a bottle up to $4,500. And it's not easy to gauge who's looking for what. So I think it's really, really important for people to sort of skip the facade, because I see this a lot from all kinds of different people where they're like, oh, and we're looking for a medium-bodied red. What should we drink? Or like, you pick. I like when people come in and say, hey, we like this, whether we know what that is or not. We tend to white Burgundy, or if it's very unspecific, hey, we tend to like spicy red wine, and we have this much money to spend. I'm probably going to overperform on, if someone comes in and says, hey, we have $50 to spend on it, we want to drink a great bottle of wine. I'm going to do my best to find the greatest possible experience for them. But it becomes very hard when there's like an opaqueness about what the expectations are.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. How do you get around the money issue, though? It's so sensitive.
But I don't understand why it has to be that way. If you're going out with someone, it might be a business thing, it might be a date, it might be a romantic, whatever. I think the greatest thing you can say is, I like Pinot Noir. Yeah, I don't have to drink a Pinot Noir, but I do like a softer red. I want to spend $100 on a bottle of wine. Then we can start looking at alternatives. Part of the skill of the sommelier is trying to gauge that. You have 20 seconds to figure out what people want. That's usually how long an interaction is.
Well, what are you looking for? How expensive their clothing is? Or what are you doing if they don't say anything?
What I do is I always try to throw out a few different alternatives and sort of gauge I don't necessarily think a long wine list is always a great wine list. I tend to think that we're moving in the direction of where smaller, more curated wine lists are better. That's what I like to work with too. It's harder to make a great small wine list than it is to make a long wine list.
I have to say you're right on, because Mark Twain, and I've said this before, said, I would have written you a short note, but I didn't have time.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
It takes time to curate. Yeah. But what if you don't want to declare out loud how much you're willing to pay for love or a first date? They're trying to be subtle.
I'll always start not on the lowest end, probably. That would offend someone too. But if you narrowed it down to someone wants to drink, then we'll look at Burgundy. I'll point out 3 different things that I think are really great wines. And then usually We might not end up with one of those three, but it's a starting point. Someone then asks us, oh, what's this like? Then we can start talking about how that's different from the next wine. And we might not be where they started, but you kind of have to prod it.
What do you think of this thing? If you're the one with the restaurant list, you tip it up towards yourself and you're pointing, and only you and the som can see, and you point to, I'd like something in this range, and you're pointing to the price, but no one else can see that you're pointing to the price. Is that a sneaky tip?
Yeah,
Okay.
That's a great way of doing it. It's not necessarily always about the money. It shouldn't be, especially when it comes to a restaurant you're unfamiliar with or you've never been there before. If they're offering things that are range from 2 to 4 or 5 figures, then, at some point you're going to have to get to that point of the discussion, right? I usually also get a sense from how well versed are people in the conversation of wine. What happens a lot, and this is something that we can get to as well, is I think one thing that is really important if you're into wine is to sort of challenge your preconceived notions about what you like and don't like. Also, one thing that I hear from guests that don't make sense, since does not make sense, you'll understand why. When people come into the restaurant and they ask for help from a sommelier or they're looking to choose a bottle of wine, I go over to them. I ask, what do you like to drink? And they say, well, we like things like Napa Valley Cabernet or Pinot Noir. At that point, those two wines are very, very different. And they kind of encompass between them all kinds of red wine. So I don't have a lot to work with. They like wine. I figured that out. That's kind of the extent of the discussion, right? Or the inverse, when people come in and they say, I don't like Sauvignon Blanc or I don't like Chardonnay. I think especially for people who are getting into wine, the first step is to figure out what you don't like. But I think the next thing a few years later is usually an epiphany where you have to challenge that. Okay. So people who may not like Chardonnay may like Chablis a lot because it's usually not what they think of when they say Chardonnay. They think about some oaky.
Whereas Chablis, Northern Burgundy, unoaked. Yeah.
That's one thing. But if you're in a new restaurant, you feel like, oh, I'm getting the sense that these guys are serious about wine. The glassware is good. The wine list is fun. Like I see a lot of things I like here. I think the best tip to get something out of that is to talk to someone, get sommelier over, say, hey, I see that you have this that I like a lot. What else should I be drinking? Or, hey, I had this wine. And today in this world, everyone has a smartphone. It's so easy to show a picture like, hey, I had this at another restaurant. Do you have anything in that similar to that? Or if I like that, do you think you have anything I would like?
Yeah.
Or one tip that I usually give is to look at the weirder sections of the wine list. What that means to you might be different. But if someone bothered to list a bunch of Hungarian wines on their wine list, there's probably a reason for that. And those wines are probably both great value and they're probably pretty delicious and interesting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Those wines are not flying off the shelves by themselves.
No.
They're there because someone cared to put them there. And I think that should count for more than it does in the mind of the consumers.
I love those tips. Look for the weird sections and then talk to your sommelier, but also if this, then that. So like the Amazon algorithm, if you bought this book, you'll like this book. Kind of similar to that. Why'd you call it Legacy Records?
So, you can go into a lot of sort of philosophy behind it. Me and my partners in this restaurant, we like people to come to our restaurant because they want to come to our restaurant. Mm-hmm. If we would have named this restaurant Chez Arvid or Amphora, people would have expectations about what type of cuisine. Is it French? Is it Italian? Is it this or is it that? And you'll only enter into their mind when they're on a Tuesday night thinking, hey, what should we eat tonight? Should we have Italian? All right, let's go to Amphora or whatever it is, right? We want people to think of us and think of the unique experience of going to this restaurant. It's a nonsensical name in the sense that it doesn't have any sort of restaurant connotation with it.
It sounds to me like an old record store, but I'm very literal. It's
what it
vinyl.
is, the address that we're on is the site of a record studio that was here earlier. It was called Legacy Recording Studios, which was the last dying sigh or whatever of the record studio industry in New York. A lot of great music has been made in the city. Right now, there are very few independent studios left.
Wow,
so it's kind of an homage to an industry that went away.
So is it a wine bar or restaurant or both? Or
it is a restaurant that also has a separate cocktail bar. Kind of a big place. It's a big sprawling. It's not a massive restaurant, but it's a pretty sizable venue. I think tonight we'll probably feed and pour wine and drinks for 200 people or so.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I'll when we're done here, I got to head down to the restaurant floor and see what's going on.
Wow. Speaking of that, time's flying.
I should loop back to what we were talking about earlier about finding great wine on the wine list. I have two very concrete tips.
Okay.
One, so the white wine, I have two glasses. The first wine that I'm drinking is from a domain that I like a lot. It is a white wine called Hume, which I think means light in Catalan. It's from a domain called Roc des Anges from Roussillon in the south of France. An area that is very, very underrated for wine, and especially for white wine. You'd think that this is kind of sun-drenched southern France bordering on Spain, but it's a really mineral, not low alcohol, it's 12.5%, but it's a really fresh, high altitude, really intensely saline and really cool different aromatics wine from a great domain, a lady called Marjorie Gallet that makes this wine. This is my sort of look off the beaten path.
Nice.
Go for things like Roussillon White, Grenache Blanc or Grenache Gris, and Macabeu. That's one tip, very concrete.
12.5% is low these days. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a delicious bottle of wine. Great value too. They make great reds too from like 100-year-old Carignan. So very worth looking for. Not expensive. The other great tip is look for lesser wines from great producers. This is a wine from one of the best producers in Barolo, Bartolo Mascarello, today run by Bartolo's daughter, Maria Teresa, a really iconic traditional Barolo producer whose wines today are highly sought after, very rare, getting up there, expensive, secondary market, auction, etc. But what I'm having here is the Dolcetto that is from this estate. So this is a lesser wine, so to speak, of this domain. It doesn't have the fancy label of Barolo or anything like that. And there are plenty of examples of this. Producers, especially all over in the old world, who make not just one wine, but they make a whole range of wine. Usually the lower appellation wines in that range are really great value. Whether that's a producer who makes an Hermitage, but also makes a Saint-Joseph or a Côte d'Aron, those wines are usually great. It's usually not that they're more mass production. No. In this sense, many of these wines are as limited as the top wines or limited in production. But, if it's something that the family's been making for 100 years, they're not going to stop making it just because another wine is sort of the bee's knees at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. We are just flying on time here, but I have to touch on natural wines because you had a blog post that really caused quite a stir, which is interesting. I always love delving into that. So tell us in a sort of micro bite, what are natural wines and how you feel about them?
I think I wrote this blog post in 2013 or something like that. And it sort of haunted me since. I had to retire my blog. I could never top that sort of initial big thing.
It's still out there.
But it got a lot of attention. So just as a background, I was working in Copenhagen at the time, and Copenhagen had a big natural wine scene. It was like Paris, Copenhagen, Tokyo had this sort of triangle of, it seemed like every great restaurant that opened had to be fully committed to serving natural wine. It was kind of a self-feeding loop where the weirder, the better. And unfortunately, what I was sort of railing against a little bit of what I saw in that was that when the most sought after restaurants, at the time it was things like Noma and all the sort of offshoot restaurants that came from that. And nothing against them. I think it's the greatest restaurant in the world. I still do. But what happened was they were attracting all of this sort of young talent. If you were an 18-year-old or 19, whatever, moving into the restaurant business, your goal, if you had ambition, was to work at Noma, right? Or to work in that circle. You got there and you were part of the sort of the rock star crew, and all you learn about is that all the classics of the wine world are doing it wrong. And instead you should drink unfiltered brown Chenin Blanc from Loire or whatever it is. The only thing that's right is, I was hearing a lot of dumb stuff at the moment. I was hearing things like, there's no great wine made in Bordeaux, or there's no good Cabernet, things like that just kind of got to me, because I really do think that the best that the natural wine world has to offer is really great. And I do think even more important than that is that whole movement and the strength of that movement has made every conventional, for lack of a better word, producer in the world of wine rethink their way of doing viticulture and winemaking and lowering intervention, lowering chemicals in the vineyard and lowering sulfur levels, etc. Things that are good, they really prompted that movement in the world of wine. So it's great that got the discussion started. I do think that the sort of the fervor has died down since those years, 2013, earlier than that. This was probably like the beginning of the 2010s. It was such a strong fanatical movement. I feel like now it's become much more sensible, and I see a lot more mixed things on these lists. Even on my list, I mean, a lot of the things that I have on my list are natural wines. I just don't like to put that term out there as such.
Right. Did it become a religion? Is it still a religion? And do you think that the term will fade away?
No, I think the term might stay, but I think what we're seeing now is a lot of sort of co-option of the term. We see giant ad campaigns for brands that are definitely not making natural wine, sort of claiming the term because it's not a regulated term. One of the giants in California recently used the term in their ad campaign, and they're making millions of bottles of mostly industrially made wine. Once that starts to happen, it really starts to dilute the value of the whole thing.
Like the term reserve, it's unregulated in the new world.
Makes no sense. Yeah. I'm really thankful for what that movement did in getting the discussion out there and making everyone rethink what they're doing in the world of wine. And I'm really thankful for the best that world has to offer, because the best wines are really great wines, and they always were great wines, even before the term natural. I guess that's that.
All right. Well, no, it was a well thought out post. I read through it, and like you, advice for winemakers, for journalists.
I haven't dared look at it. It's also been, like I said, a 5 years period sometimes. So it's hard to go back and defend something that old. But yeah.
Well, it's like stirring the lees or recirculating the cap. It will keep coming back. You know what? I haven't even got to half the questions I wanted to ask you, Arvid, but is there anything we've left out that you'd like to mention now as we wrap up?
I saw one of your questions was your favorite sort of wine gadgets.
Yeah, please.
And I wanted to share a couple of things that I think are both sort of high and low and really fun and really solve some problems in the wine world that are not usually thought of, and they're no good solutions. Some of them are fancy wine tools. There are things like the Durand wine key if you're opening old bottles of wine. This is a fancy kind of high-end wine key. It's a combination of sort of an osso and a lever, and it helps to pull out really, really old corks. I like this sometimes. It's kind of a crutch too. You can get good at opening old corks with a regular wine key of some sort. But I'd like to show 3 things that I think are really fun, that are very inexpensive and are really good, especially if you're opening up a fun old bottle of wine, or especially a big bottle of wine.
Great.
So 2 of these come from the sort of chemical lab. You can order them off Amazon. And the last of them come from any hardware store. So my 2 favorite tools that I use on a daily basis in a restaurant is a pipette.
Is that a wine thief?
It is a wine thief. There are fancy sort of glass versions like you use in a lab, right? Or to baste your turkey or whatever it is.
It looks very technical. Back to nanotechnology. Yes. Why do you use those? What are you using them for?
Let's say I have an old bottle of wine. I do open up a lot of old fancy wine. So if you open up something that's 20, 30 years old and you're not sure how this wine is doing, but you don't want to upend the bottle and pour yourself a pour, because that means shaking up all the sediment, right? So what you do is you open up your bottle, you take the cork out, and then you can easily steal a little sample out of it without disturbing the wine. And then you can decide, hey, am I decanting this now? Am I decanting it later? Am I decanting it not at all, or just a minute before service? That's a good tool. Don't shake up the sediment in the bottle. Next tool is another Chem Lab thing. I guess you could use a regular Q-tip, but they're a little short. So I buy these sort of lab. You can buy like 100 of these for $10.
Where do you buy those?
Amazon. Just search for Swab.
Swab. Oh, right.
If you ever have a crumbly old cork, so if you open up a bottle of wine and there are little residues of cork, you can either use this to kind of stick it in the bottle, and the action of surface tension will sort of suck a little liquid up into the cotton swab along with those bits of cork. It's great. It's a very, very good tool. And this is going to shock some people, but let's say you're hosting a big party and you want to serve that double magnum or that 6-liter bottle that you've been saving for a few years. And that bottle can be decanted. But anything above a magnum is really tough to decant properly. The glass is so thick that you can't see through it with a candle. Probably can't hold it. Best tool you can get, the rubber hose. This will cost you a few dollars in any hardware store. Just rubber, shouldn't be thick enough to cover the holes out of the bottle. You stick that into the bottle to the level where if you have a bottle standing up, which you should if you're going to decant it.
I love this.
So that you don't get all the way to the bottom, but sort of a safe distance, so you can then decant off the rest normally. And then you either It created the pressure.
Yeah.
Just love it. From the ever siphon gas or whatever you've done, you know the
Yeah,
trick.
that's what I'm going to say is if you're siphoning gas, if you're stealing gas, just use the same technique.
Yeah. That's the most gentle way you can decant a bottle of wine. There's no air influence. There's no stirring of any sediment because you're only decanting from sort of up in the bottle. You can lower it slowly down as you see the sediment. You use a flashlight on the other side. So it's very high tech and very low tech at the same time.
I love it. Oh my gosh.
Don't fall for all the $100 gadgets. You can get a long way with some really, really simple tools.
That is fabulous. Only from you, Arvid, with your combination background of nanotechnology, engineering, and wine. So tell us where we can connect with you online. This has been fabulous.
I'm barely on social media. I used to be good at that, again, before opening a restaurant and having a baby. I'm on social media, but I'm not that active. I'll get better. At Arvid Rosengren, so just my name spelled out on every platform, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram.
And your restaurant is Legacy Records?
Legacy Records. It is legacyrecordsnyc.com.
NYC.com.
And I think it's Legacy Records Restaurant on Instagram. That's probably where we're the most active.
People will look for that. Arvid, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I couldn't have asked for better. Lots of great advice, tips, and stories. I really appreciate you sharing your time with us.
Thank you so much. Great being here.
Bye-bye. Take care. Wasn't that terrific? So here are my takeaways from this discussion. Number 1, I love how Arvid found a way to combine seemingly disparate worlds, nanotechnology engineering and wine, through his twin passions of figuring things out and nurturing people. 2, Arvid challenges us to re-examine our preconceived notions of certain wines, especially when someone has cared enough to put them on a wine list. Look for those weird wine sections on the list and ask the som or server about those wines. 3, also search for wines from regions not known for them, such as a zesty white wine from southern France, better known for its big reds. The same concept applies to a wine producer. Look for second wines, like a grape they're not famous for. He used the example of Brunello versus Dolcetto. 4, I never thought about how temperature can really throw off a wine and food pairing, such as the chill of ice cream making a sauterne taste less sweet and more alcoholic. And 5, you gotta love his suggestion for decanting bottles larger than a Magnum. Keep it real and bring out the garden hose. You'll find links to my wine reviews as well as to the wine gadgets that Arvid mentioned in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/19. So what was your favorite tip or quote from this episode? Please share that with me on Twitter or Facebook and tag me at Natalie MacLean, or on Instagram, I'm at Natalie MacLean Wine. You'll also find the links to the social media channels for both Arvid himself and his restaurant, Legacy Records, plus bonus tips for this episode at nataliemaclean.com/19. If you liked this episode, please tell a friend about it. My podcast is really easy to find, whether you search on its name, Unreserved Wine Talk, or my name. Finally, if you want to take your ability to pair food and wine to the next level, join me in a free online video wine class at nataliemaclean.com/class. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.